Viewers, good evening and thank you for joining us here on Times Now. You're watching News Now Overnight and I'm Rohit Srivatsa. Let's begin the broadcast by putting our focus on what's transpiring in Europe, where world leaders have now gathered in Evian in France for the G7 huddle. Two issues are expected to dominate discussions, and these are the Russia-Ukraine war and also the evolving situation in the Middle East. Now, India is not a member of the G7, but in today's geopolitical landscape, India, being made part of such a conversation, has become a global necessity. Prime Minister Narendra Modi reached the French city of Evian earlier today, and this is the 7th consecutive G7 summit that the Prime Minister is attending. Now, apart from this summit, the Prime Minister will also hold significant bilateral meetings with several world leaders on the sidelines. Prime Minister Narendra Modi shared pictures from the G7 meeting in France, one of them also showing him posing for a picture alongside global leaders like the US President Donald Trump, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Earlier, the Prime Minister Modi also held bilaterals with the UK Prime Minister and also the Canadian Prime Minister, along with the President of the United Arab Emirates as well, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan.
So Prime Minister Modi's had bilateral meetings with the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney. Remember, India and Canada have been negotiating for a comprehensive economic partnership agreement. Both Canada and India have had troubles with their largest trading partner, which is the United States of America. Canada, too, on the issue of steel and coal, has had running issues with Donald Trump and his tariffs. Canada, much like India, has also not thrashed out a major trade deal with the United States. As far as India is concerned, that interim trade agreement is still very much elusive. Jameson Greer, who is the U.S. trade representative, is expected to travel to India next week. So clearly, Canada and India have a joint interest, if you will, in coming together and ensuring that they fast-track this SEPA, or the Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Of course, the value of trade between India and Canada is not as much as between India and the United States. It's a fraction. But I think given what the Trump tariffs, the manner in which it's upended the global trading order, it's only natural that India and Canada and other middle powers, that's the phrase that Mark Carney had used in his famous Davos speech earlier this year, where he said that middle powers need to come together to try and diversify the risks involved with the upending of the global trading order. So that, I think, is a critical issue that was discussed between the two prime ministers. Prime Minister Modi also met with the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, and again, the contrast here is interesting because one of the first FTAs that India has had with a Western power is with Britain. The FTA was signed again sometime last year. So it's going to be close to a year. It's going to come up on a year since the India-UK FTA has been signed. And again, this is a good example because remember, the reason why Britain got into these FTAs with other individual countries like India, for example, is because they pulled out of the European Union in the form of Brexit back in 2016. And even with India, you know, the trade agreement had been negotiated for a number of years. Multiple prime ministers had changed in Britain. It started under Boris Johnson and then subsequently Rishi Sunak, and then eventually it was last year under Keir Starmer that the FTA was signed. But now that the FTA is signed, both leaders got an opportunity to take stock of the progress of this FTA and also how to action their vision for 2030. That's the India-UK trade roadmap that both leaders have laid out for India and the UK. So clearly, in the meetings that Prime Minister has had, the individual separate bilateral meetings with both Mark Carney of Canada and Keir Starmer of the UK, trade was very much front and center of these parleys.
But naturally, the one meeting that everyone is going to watch very closely is the meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the US President Donald Trump. That will be the main focus among all the meetings that are taking place at the G7 summit. This is also going to be the first meeting since February 2025 when the two leaders came face to face at the White House. Managing editor Zaka Jacob gets us more on that.
Prime Minister Modi and President Trump will be meeting Wednesday afternoon here in Evian on the sidelines of the G7 summit. This is the first time that Prime Minister Modi and President Trump will be meeting in almost a year and a half. The last time they met was in February of 2025 at the White House. Thereafter, there have been some sticking points in the relationship. The trade issue has not been resolved fully. The interim trade agreement has still not been concluded between India and the United States. In fact, the US chief trade representative, Jameson Greer, is going to be in New Delhi, I think, next week. So that issue is top of mind for both the Indian and American leaders. But more proximately and more recently, an issue that's caused a lot of outrage in India as well is the killing of the 3 Indian sailors off the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, in Omani waters, the United States has not expressed any kind of regret or remorse for the same. In fact, some would say, and certainly some supporters of the BJP have taken grave exception to the statement that was put out by the US State Department, which seemed rather contrite. Like I said, no remorse, no apologies. So this is an issue that is expected to be taken up when the Prime Minister and the President meet. And overall, the feeling is that the strategic partnership of the last 25 years is seeing some chinks. It is definitely seeing some sticking points, and perhaps now is the time for both the leaders to put their heads together at the highest level to try and iron out these differences.
And like managing editor Zaka Jacob was just saying, all eyes will be on that crucial meeting, because this is the first meeting since last year, since February 2025 last year, when this meeting took place. And besides, in June last year, when he also left the G7 summit, Donald Trump had left the G7 summit midway last year. And what followed then was the first round of attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities. This time, the focus is also once again on the US-Iran conflict, and also the world is hoping for a swift resolution of this. Our next report gets you more. France is all set to host the G7 summit this year. And the French president is going all out to woo Donald Trump and is giving it all that it takes. Dinners, golf, and even a tour at France's Grand Palace. A palace built for kings, gold-covered halls, crystal chandeliers, the famous Hall of Mirrors. Because as world leaders prepare for one of the most important summits of the year, France has a very specific concern: making sure that Donald Trump actually stays. According to reports from Paris, the French president is considering one of the most extravagant diplomatic gestures in his arsenal: a private dinner with Donald Trump at the legendary Palace of Versailles. Just Macron and Trump inside one of the most lavish palaces on earth. The timing is no coincidence. The dinner is being planned around the G7 summit in France, a summit expected to be dominated by 2 major crises: Russia's war in Ukraine and the growing uncertainty surrounding Iran. Both issues that European leaders desperately want Washington engaged in. But there is a problem: Donald Trump. Because nobody knows exactly what Donald Trump will do. For nearly a decade, world leaders have searched for the formula, the secret recipe for dealing with Trump. Some tried pressure, some even tried criticism, and others tried persuasion. The leaders who had the most success often chose something else: flattery, pageantry, spectacle, and sometimes a touch of royalty. Trump has repeatedly shown admiration for grand settings, royal ceremonies, and historic landmarks. European diplomats have noticed, and Versailles may be the ultimate example. One European official summed it up perfectly: the stakes are unusually high. French officials reportedly fear that Trump could cut his visit short, or worse, derail the summit altogether. Not only this, but the French officials reportedly delayed the summit altogether so that Trump could attend the summit, which was actually scheduled to start from the 14th of June. It was then shifted so that Trump could watch the historic UFC cage fight at White House and then could make it to the summit. Remember, this is the same president who has often criticized multilateral organizations like the G7 and questioned the value of traditional alliances. And right now, tensions are rising everywhere. The Iran conflict remains unresolved. The Strait of Hormuz remains a flashpoint. Ukraine continues to dominate Europe's security agenda. The last thing European leaders want is a summit overshadowed by a dramatic Trump exit, just like what happened in Canada last year. So Macron appears to be preparing an insurance policy. But then there's another question: will any of this actually work? Because the geopolitical landscape has changed dramatically. Trump's tariff battles, disagreements over Ukraine, growing tensions over Iran. Many European officials privately wonder whether charm alone can still influence Washington. Flattery only works when there's leverage, and Europe's leverage is limited. As world leaders gather to discuss the war, trade, and global security, the most important negotiations might not happen inside the summit hall, but they might happen beneath the chandeliers of Versailles, over dinner between Emmanuel Macron and Donald Trump. Because in 2026, the battle for global diplomacy may begin with a seat at the King's table. Bureau Report, Times Now. With that, we are now getting in a statement from the Ministry of External Affairs, which says Prime Minister Modi has participated in the outreach session on forging new partnerships and also rebuilding international solidarity, and this was at the G7 summit. The Prime Minister has underscored the importance of trust in building international partnerships, especially in an increasingly interconnected world. He said that the world should move from donor-recipient to partnership-based solidarity and equality. The Prime Minister also highlighted that India has always followed a humanity-first approach, which is reflected in India-led International Solar Alliance, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, Global Biofuel Alliance, Mission Life, and Ek Ped Maa Ke Naam initiatives. And that is India's vision of international partnership. And this is also rooted in the timeless philosophy of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, the world is one family. That is the latest statement that has come in from the Ministry of External Affairs.